The year is 30 BCE, Alexandria, Egypt. The morning light cuts through the stone corridors of the palace that is no longer hers. Her name was Cleopatra Selene. She was 17 years old. 2 months ago, her father, the Ptolemaic king of the Eastern Mediterranean, had been defeated. Last month, she and her 3 younger brothers were paraded through Rome's streets in chains as living trophies. The crowd screamed. Children threw fruit. Dust from 10,000 feet coated her face. Now, in the pre-dawn darkness of a chamber beneath the palace, she stands motionless. Her hands are bound behind her back with leather cords. The knots are tight enough that her fingers have begun to go numb. She wears only a thin shift. Her royal purple robe has been taken from her, and the stone floor is cold enough that she can feel it through the soles of her feet. She has been standing here for hours. She does not know why. A guard enters. He does not look at her face. He looks at her body the way a merchant examines cattle before purchase. When he leaves, he closes the door so quietly that she almost doesn't hear it. She wants to cry, but she learned long ago that tears accomplish nothing. Instead, she fixes her eyes on a single crack in the wall and watches a small drop of water suspended at the opening, catching the gray dawn light. The drop trembles. It falls. Another takes its place. Outside this chamber, in the rooms above, she can hear the sounds of the Roman court beginning to wake. Footsteps on marble. A servant dropping something and flinching at the sound. Someone laughing. The sounds of a world that has moved on, that no longer counts her as anything worth remembering. She is no longer a queen. She is no longer even a person with a name that matters. She is something new. Something the Roman Empire has created a place for, deep in its laws and customs. She is what happens when power is absolute and mercy is the one thing the powerful can afford to sacrifice. What she is about to experience over the next 10 years will not be quick. It will not be merciful. And by the time it ends, if it ends, she will have learned what it means to be completely unmade. This is her story. But it is not her story alone. It belongs to dozens of women whose names were carved into histories and then deliberately erased. Queens and princesses from Gaul, from Britannia, from Egypt, from the Levant, from Nubia. Powerful women whose power was the very thing that made their destruction a necessity for Rome. What Rome did to these women was not irrational cruelty. It was policy. Before we continue, you need to understand something. This is not mythology. This is not legend softened by time or embellished by storytellers. What follows is drawn from the historical record, from the writings of those who witnessed it, from the laws that governed it, and from the monuments and artifacts that survivors left behind. Roman historians like Cassius Dio and Suetonius recorded the fates of defeated queens with matter-of-factness that is almost more disturbing than exaggeration. They wrote about these women like government officials writing policy decisions, stripped of emotion, stripped of humanity, simply stating what happened, because to those chroniclers it was normal. Expected. The cost of opposing Rome. We have temple records from Egypt documenting the disappearances of royal women. We have coins bearing queens' faces, minted 1 year and never again, erased from official currency. We have letters from emperors to governors discussing the disposal of captured nobility with the tone of merchants discussing inventory. Archaeological excavations uncovered private chambers in imperial palaces where these women were kept. Frescoes depict scenes of daily life, women at looms, at baths, but notable only for what they omit. No dignity, no autonomy, no agency. Just bodies performing functions. The legal codes of Rome explicitly outline the status of captured enemy royalty. The Digest of Justinian, compiled centuries later but drawing on imperial precedent, details the property rights an emperor held over defeated foreign rulers and their families. These women were not prisoners in the modern sense. They were not criminals awaiting trial. Legally, they were res privatae, private possessions of the state, to be used as the state saw fit. What we are about to walk through is not reconstructed fiction. Every detail you will hear is grounded in testimony. Every ritual described was recorded. Every name that appears was written down, sometimes by the woman herself in a moment of desperate defiance, sometimes by a servant who witnessed and could not forget. This is the archive of atrocity, and we owe it to these women, to Cleopatra Selene, to Vercingetorix's daughter, to the unnamed princesses of Judea and Nubia and the Levant, to speak their names again, to remember, to refute the silence that Rome imposed on them. To understand what Rome did to these women, you must first understand why. This was not sadism for its own sake. This was not the random cruelty of individual tyrants. This was policy, deliberate, systematic, and justified by the most powerful arguments Rome could construct: law, military necessity, divine will, and public spectacle. When Rome conquered a kingdom, emperors and generals faced a persistent problem. The conquered nobility could rebel. They had networks of loyalty, claims to legitimacy, memories of independence. A king could be executed, his army disbanded, but his widow, daughters, sisters remained symbols. As long as they lived, there was a rallying point for resistance. As long as they were free, they were dangerous. Rome could not simply kill royal families. It would seem like needless brutality, and Rome cared about its public image. Instead, Rome needed to transform these women into something broken, something that could no longer inspire hope in conquered peoples. The emperors called this process damnatio, condemnation. It involved complete systematic erasure of identity. A queen's name would be changed or erased from official records. Her children would be taken from her, her titles stripped away. She would be given new clothes, new rituals, new rules governing every moment. The goal was to make her invisible to history, while making her visible as a monument to Rome's power. Consider the religious dimension. Many defeated queens came from nations with their own gods and sacred traditions. Rather than suppressing these faiths outright, which would provoke rebellion, Rome appropriated them. A queen of Egypt would serve in a Roman temple, performing rituals that mixed her native traditions with Roman authority. She wore the vestments of her ancestors, but under absolute Roman command. Her sacred knowledge was stolen and reframed as service to Rome. She became a living sacrifice, not to her own gods, but to Rome's power. Archaeological evidence supports this. In imperial palaces, archaeologists found entire wings for housing captured royal women. They were not dungeons, but luxurious, with one crucial feature: no exits except through guard stations, gilded cages. The message was clear: you live in comfort because Rome permits it. That comfort is a privilege. The system served a psychological function beyond the imprisoned women themselves. Every conquered nation saw what happened to its queens. The message burned into their consciousness. This is the cost of female resistance. This is what Rome does to powerful women. Surrender your hope. Surrender belief that your daughters will be safe. The result was cultural terrorism, precisely calibrated to destroy the will to resist. For Rome's ruling class, these women served another purpose: proof of dominance. An emperor could parade and display them, demonstrating that his power extended into the most intimate chambers of defeated enemies. They became propaganda made flesh, living proof that no one, Not kings, not priests, not queens with ancient lineages could withstand Roman will. We return now to Cleopatra Selene. Let us watch her day. Not one day, but the structure of every day, because the system's cruelty lay not in sudden violence, but in the grinding monotony of control. This is what it looked like to be slowly unmade. She is woken before dawn by a bell. Not gently. The bell rings throughout the women's quarters, a converted section of the imperial palace that houses 7 other captured royalty, though she is forbidden from learning their names. Speaking to them, touching them, even acknowledging their presence beyond a glance is prohibited. She has learned this through punishment. 3 days without water after she tried to whisper comfort to a Nubian princess who had arrived in chains 2 months prior. The first ritual of the day is purification. She kneels in cold water while attendants wash her according to strict rules. Every part of her body is touched and inspected. They are looking for marks of self-harm, for signs of defiance. Her hair, which was once luxuriant, has been cut short. It was shorn the day she arrived, in a ceremony announced to the other prisoners as a baptism into her new life. She watched in a polished mirror as her identity fell to the floor. The hair grows back, but she cannot style it. It is kept brutally functional. After purification comes dressing. She is given a Roman stola made of coarse linen, deliberately unflattering, designed to erase the body beneath. No choice of color, no choice of ornament. She must dress in 3 minutes or loses her midday meal. Then comes inspection. A Roman official enters the dormitory with a tablet and a stylus. He walks past each woman without looking at them directly. They have been given numbers instead of names, and he calls them by these numbers when he speaks. Selene is now called only Aegyptus 5. The inspection involves a check of her clothing, her posture, her fingernails. Once she kept her nails long as an act of subtle rebellion, a tiny insistence on beauty, on self-definition. The official noticed. Her fingernails were cut to the quick while she was held down. The message was clear. You do not own even your own body. The work begins at sunrise. Selene works at a loom in the imperial textile workshops, alongside women from Britannia, Gaul, Judea. They weave cloth for Roman soldiers, for the machinery of their own oppression. The work is precise. If a thread drops, if the pattern wavers, hours of work must be unraveled and redone. The metaphor is not lost on any of them. An older woman works at the adjacent loom. Her name was Lilia. She had been a queen of Britannia before Rome came. She has been imprisoned for 17 years. Her face is lined, her hands gnarled, her eyes empty. She was once young like Selene. Now she is a living warning. When Selene makes a mistake, Lilia catches her eye and shakes her head. Not in judgment, but in understanding. At midday there is food. A bowl of thin gruel, a piece of bread, a cup of water. Barely enough to maintain strength, which is intentional. Weakness makes resistance harder. Selene eats standing up, alone, in absolute silence. Speaking during meals is forbidden. So is singing, humming, anything that might comfort the spirit. In the afternoon comes Roman indoctrination. A tutor teaches them Latin, Roman law, Roman history. He teaches them Rome's greatness, its inevitability, the justice of its dominion. He teaches them that resistance was futile, that their families were weak, their kingdoms not conquered but saved. Selene listens with a blank face while her mind resists, but the tutor sees the slight tightening of her jaw. He notes it. There are consequences for incorrect attitudes. Evenings bring isolation. She is locked alone in a small chamber with a pallet and a chamber pot. A window too high to see through. Occasionally, she hears the city of Rome outside, unaware she exists. Sometimes, she sings quietly, Egyptian songs from childhood. If heard, there is punishment. She has been caught twice. But the songs are worth it. They are the last piece of Egypt she can claim. A young woman arrived 6 months ago. Guards call her Judea III. She still believes things might change, that Rome might soften. Selene tries to warn her without words, a look, a gesture, that this hope is dangerous. It leads to escape attempts. It leads to worse. But Judea III is not ready. She whispers prayers at night, believing that if righteous enough, she will be saved. Selene listens with compassion she can barely afford. Days pass this way. Weeks. Years. The seasons change beyond the high windows. Selene grows older in this space, and the girl who once was a queen becomes something else. Someone whose memories of independence feel like dreams, like things that happened to another person. This is the final victory of the system. Not to kill her, but to make her forget that she was ever anything other than this. The daily control we have just described was the scaffolding, but the system had a center, a core ritual that transformed these women from prisoners into something Rome had a legal and religious justification for violating. It was called the Ceremonium Dominationis, the ceremony of dominion, and it was the official mechanism by which an emperor asserted absolute ownership over the body and will of a defeated queen. For Selene, it came on her 20th birthday. She was not told it was coming. She was taken at night and brought to a chamber deep in the palace she had never seen. The room was lit by dozens of oil lamps. Incense hung in the air, myrrh and something unidentifiable. The walls displayed images of submission, defeated peoples kneeling before a throne. The message was painted into the very stones. An official entered and told her that she was about to fulfill her function, that she was no longer a queen, not even a prisoner, but a res privatae, a piece of property with no rights, no claim to dignity, no power of refusal. He explained this to her as if reading from a legal document, which, in a sense, he was. He was explaining the law that had already decided her fate. What followed was absolute power asserted through her body. It was not framed as rape. Rape implies crime. It was framed as exercise of property rights. The ceremony included religious components, prayers to Roman gods, making it piety, not brutality. Ritual, not violation. Language and law had been constructed to make atrocity legible as justice. Afterward came ritual humiliation. She was given minimal clothing and paraded through palace corridors so servants would see her and understand. The Egyptian queen is broken. The Egyptian queen belongs to Rome. Resistance is futile. You are all potential prey. 3 years after this ceremony, a second one was announced. Selene felt something shift inside her when she heard. Not fear. She had learned to exist beyond fear, but a kind of clarity. She would not submit without protest. When the official came to fetch her, she refused to move. She sat on the floor of her cell and simply would not stand. It was a small rebellion. It was also futile. What they did to her for that refusal was methodical. She was not beaten. That would have left visible marks, and the system preferred to keep these women presentable. Instead, she was isolated for 2 weeks with minimal food. Her cellmate, Judea III, was taken away as punishment for Selene's defiance. Selene never saw her again. She assumed the worst, and the assumption was likely correct. The system punished not just the rebellious, but those around them. Resistance was made not just painful, but toxic. Any attempt to resist injured others, which made resistance a betrayal of those you loved. These ceremonies continued. They were irregular, which was part of the psychological design. Selene might endure weeks of relative peace and then be summoned without warning. The unpredictability was a weapon. She could not plan, could not prepare mentally, could not build walls around the parts of herself that remained intact. Each time, a little more of her was unmade. Each time, the law and religion and rhetoric of Rome arranged themselves around the fact of her violation and transformed it into something justified, something inevitable, something that she, in the perverse logic of the system, deserved. By the 2nd century, the treatment of defeated queens had become routine. But this was not always the case. In the early years of imperial conquest, voices in the Senate raised objections. Some argued that the Ceremonium Dominationis violated Rome's own laws. Others claimed it was unseemly, contrary to the ideals Rome claimed to uphold. These objections were debated and overruled. The legal framework justifying the system was elaborate. A senator might argue for protection, but the emperor could point to precedent, to religious sanction, to practical necessity. The Senate, dependent on imperial goodwill, would acquiesce. The objections faded. The system continued. What changed was not the practice, but its visibility. Laws made it technically illegal to discuss what happened to these women in public. The imperial palace was declared off-limits to the historical record. Official histories omitted defeated queens' names entirely or mentioned them only in vague terms suggesting comfortable retirements. When a queen's name appeared on a coin, it was minted briefly, then withdrawn and replaced. The women were erased not just from life, but from memory. Some emperors attempted reform, moved by conscience or advisors warning the system was a moral liability. They declared that captured women would be treated more humanely. New regulations were issued. On parchment, they looked impressive. Promises of retained names, adequate food, protection from worst abuses. But in the palace depths, reality was different. The system was too embedded. Guards still silenced women. Ceremonies still occurred. The treatment was merely less visible. What is most striking is what the historical record does not contain. There are no detailed accounts of resistance movements led by these women, no records of escape attempts beyond a handful of isolated incidents, no evidence of collective rebellion. This silence itself is instructive. It suggests that the system was devastatingly effective at breaking the will of those it imprisoned. It suggests that by the time any woman might have thought to organize resistance, she had already been systematized, dehumanized, and isolated to such a degree that the capacity for collective action no longer existed. By the time Cleopatra Selene reached middle age, she survived to her late 50s, which was remarkable given the conditions. The women's quarters of the imperial palace had become a kind of necropolis of the living. Women who had once commanded armies, who had ruled nations, who had borne the weight of crowns, now occupied cells in a basement, tending looms and waiting for a summons they dreaded. The laws had been written to permit this. The religion had been interpreted to justify it. The history had been rewritten to deny it. Rome had created a perfect system. Atrocity wrapped in legality, dressed in the language of justice, and sealed behind walls that the outside world had been taught not to see. Cleopatra Selene died in the year 5 CE, in that dark chamber beneath the imperial palace. She had been a prisoner for 55 years. She was 72 years old. Most of what we know of her comes not from triumphant histories, but from fragmentary sources, from coins that were minted and then deliberately withdrawn, from the silence around her name in official records. The most detailed account of her life comes from a single passing reference in a later historian, written with such brevity that it almost seems accidental that her suffering was documented at all. When she died, no one announced it publicly. There was no state funeral. Her body was disposed of without ceremony, and her quarters in the palace were given to another captive woman, whose name, too, would be lost to history. The machinery of Rome moved on, the empire continued, and the world forgot her. But we should not forget. And here is why. What happened to Cleopatra Selene was not aberration. It was not the product of a uniquely cruel emperor or a uniquely brutal age. It was the logical conclusion of a simple principle that Rome held at its core: that power is the right to use others, that civilization is measured not by its compassion, but by its ability to impose its will, and that those who lose are entitled to nothing. This principle did not die with Rome. We see it in the colonial systems that conquered Africa, Asia, and the Americas, justifying enslavement through the same arguments: civilization, progress, destiny. We see it in how modern states treat refugees and prisoners, creating systems so elegant and bureaucratic they feel like justice rather than cruelty. We permit atrocities in distant places, secure in knowing they do not happen in our homes. The ruins of Rome still stand. The Colosseum draws millions of tourists each year who photograph the corridors and marvel at the engineering and grandeur. But few know that beneath these monuments, in chambers they will never see, women were imprisoned for decades and erased from history. The tourists stand on the bones of the powerless and feel nothing, because the stones are clean. Rome understood that atrocity becomes acceptable when done quietly, written into law, justified by religion and philosophy. This is what we must understand. This was not chaos. This was not the breakdown of civilization. This was civilization at work. This was what the most sophisticated, educated, technologically advanced society in the Western world chose to do with its power. And so we must ask ourselves, what systems of control are we building in our own time that future generations will look back on in horror? What atrocities are we committing in the language of justice, behind walls we pretend not to see? The deeper truth is this: civilization is not measured by its monuments. It is not measured by the sophistication of its laws or the grandeur of its architecture. Civilization is measured by how it treats those with no power to resist. And if that is the measure, then Rome was never civilized at all. And neither are we, until we reckon with the systems we permit, the silences we enforce, and the suffering we choose not to see. If you believe that these stories shouldn't be forgotten, that the names of the powerless deserve to be spoken, that uncomfortable truths matter more than comforting myths, then subscribe. The next time you see a monument to power, remember what was beneath it. The next time you hear an empire justify its cruelty in the language of justice, remember Cleopatra Selene. Remember Lilia of Britannia. Remember all the unnamed women in all the dark chambers, and ask yourself, who are we imprisoning now? In the end, she was simply a woman who was born into a world that had decided she was prey. She tried to resist, and the world broke her. She tried to survive, and the world erased her. But her story remains, fragmented and broken as she was, a whisper across 2,000 years. And if we listen, really listen, we might hear something in that whisper that forces us to look at our own reflection in the mirror of history and ask if we like what we see.